Boa noite. Bem-vindos ao Teatro Maria Matos, aqui ao vivo e também na internet. Hoje estamos aqui para a terceira conferência no ciclo sobre a transição. Vai ser uma conferência em inglês e por isso também vou mudar para o inglês. I'm very happy to present you Carolyn Steele and Sofia Gates-Vaz. Sofia accepted to do the moderation of this night, and she's also going to talk a little bit before Carolyn is talking, a little bit about the project she's working on, which is called Perda, and that has published this little book here a couple of months ago, Do Campo ao Garfo, Desperdício Alimentar in Portugal. But back to the program tonight, so we start with a short intervention by Sofia, then Carolyn will talk, and then we'll have a part with question and answer. I still want to say that, and Carolyn Steele, of course, but that you know, because that was published. She wrote this brilliant book. I can suggest it to anybody to read. It's very well written and also very interesting and also a pleasure to read. So I can very much, it's called Hungry City. Just some last things that I have to say, which are also important, is this cycle of conferences is organized in the framework of House on Fire, which is an international network of which Teatro Maria Matos is a member, and is supported by the European project Programa Cultura. It's also important, and would like to stress this, a big thanks to the British Council who have been with us in our effort to talk about sustainability and transition already since more than 2 years. And once again, they have helped us to bring Carolyn Steele to Lisbon. And finally, also thanks for the live video streaming to the Fundação para Computação Científica Nacional, who have helped us a lot to put this to work. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll give the word to Sofia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good afternoon to everybody, particularly to Mark Deputer and to Carolyn Steele, that are the main actors in this evening. I want to congratulate Teatro Maria Matos for this cycle of conferences on transition, because I think we need desperately to think and discuss all these issues and start thinking on really new alternatives for these business as usual growth scenarios that are missing the real problems of our times. We have an unsustainable and unethical system, and we're not getting the right answers for it. Usually I like to present myself as I started as an environmental engineer, and then I evolved into environmental philosophy. And I don't know if you know the difference, but first I wanted to solve all environmental problems of the world, and now I just think about them. And this is a bit of a joke, but it has a lot in it. And I think Caroline is a bit the same. Probably she started solving all these architectural problems, and then she evolved into thinking more properly about the space. As Mark said, I was involved with some colleagues on a project on food waste. As we all know, and Caroline will share this with me, I think we eat too much, we eat unsustainably, we eat unhealthy, we eat unethically, and then on top of that, we waste a lot of food. And so this makes absolutely no sense in a world where 1/6 is starving. So we organized this project that won an award, and for 1 year we were trying to understand how much and why do we waste so much food. We try to organize the project along a transdisciplinary methodology, looking at the empirical level, what we do, and then a more pragmatic level, what we are capable of doing, and then the normative, what should we do, and then this upper level, the purposive level, what we really want to do. And I think it's probably is very much as Carolyn is also thinking about these lines in how to really think about the problems of our times. So we try to identify in the food chain, in the production level, in the agro-industrial level, the distribution level, and then the family level, why do we waste so much food and how much we do. So we followed this FAO methodology in order for the numbers to be comparable, and we got to this figure of 1 million tons wasted every year in Portugal, which is not a lot compared with other countries. It's more or less 20% of what we produce, even though it's an enormous figure. Other countries in Europe, and especially in the United States, they can go much more higher than we do. I think we are quite smart in food in a way. I don't know how much Carolyn knows about our diet, but I
delicious.
Think, yes. And on top of that, we are good in wasting a bit less than the others, but still 1 million tons is a lot of food and too much food to be wasted. The figures we got in the production level, we waste around 300 kilotons, and then agro-industrial, who are the most effective, is only around 100, and then distribution, which is supermarkets and all the distribution chain, more around 300, and then at our homes, families, consumers, it's another 300 kilotons. So it's a lot of food that we throw every day to the waste bin. We also organized this project in order to be, the project is called, in Portuguese, Projeto de Estudo e Reflexão sobre o Desperdício Alimentar. So it's also reflect upon, so not just identifying and quantifying, but also think a bit further, why are our systems organized like this, and why we waste so much food waste. And one thing we thought was very important was a communication of the project. So I don't know if you've heard about this project before. I hope so, because I think it was a very successful communication project. As the book was launched in December, and we were on all TVs and all newspapers, Expresso, Público, on radio. So if you heard about food waste around Christmas, it was because of our project, and because we were trying to talk and make people more aware of the food waste problem. Because one of the results we got for people to waste less is just to be aware of it. If you are aware of it, then you'll waste less. This seems quite simple, but we did some focus groups, and a friend of mine was part of it, and at the end she said, now, just because I participated in that focus group, I'm always thinking about when I waste food, and so I'm wasting much less. Okay, wow. So this idea of developing and implementing improved systems that reduce wastefulness is a cornerstone of any transition to a more sustainable world, and I think that's why also Mark invited us to be here. If you are really interested on the theme, I have here a couple of books, not many, so ask me for one only if you're really interested, because you are 100 in the room and I have here 10, just 10 or 12 books. So if you're really interested, then I can give you one of these books, but it's also available on the net, and we have a Facebook and a site and all these communication devices that everybody has. So now, I think we are here to hear Carolyn, so I would just like briefly to introduce her. I think the biography, she doesn't want me to tell her biography, and I don't want to tell her biography. You can go to the internet and you'll get all this list of how important she is. But I would just wanted to focus on two things. One is that she's an architect. An architect, I think, have this wonderful skill of looking at the space and being able to fill it, and being able to create a space. So from nothing, they can build something, which I think is a very important skill that most of us don't have. And so you are, when you have this capacity, then it's more easy to look at the problems in a global way, in a global structure, and not piecemeal answers to little problems, but seeing it, you see this empty space and you can put a building on it. I always think it's amazing that someone can imagine something from an empty space. So I think this is very important for the second thing I would like to say, which is what I think is most missing in our both research and also in our lives, which is interdisciplinarity. And it's this way of people that work on two subjects on the same way, or two people with two different backgrounds working together, and this enriches a lot the way we can solve problems. So I hope, so it's really good that when we are confronted with people that do things differently from us. And so if she's an architect and if she's working on food, I'm sure that all the answers she's coming up with are very different from the answers that people that only work with food would come up with. And so that's why I think it's so important that we're going to listen to her. And also is this idea of cross-fertilization of ideas that is so important when you deal with two subjects at the same time. And that's the way I wanted to present you. I don't know if it's enough. And because we are here mainly to listen to her, I will sit there to see the wonderful slides that she has, and I would like you to warmly welcome Carolyn still.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sophia. I'm just checking that I'm audible. Sorry about the faffing about. It was because my scarf was hiding my microphone. Is that functional now? Splendid. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in Lisbon, and many thanks indeed to Mark for inviting me, and to Sophia for that inspiring introduction. I look forward to discussing many of the ideas that she just mentioned to you, and I hope many others, in about an hour's time. I'm going to give myself an hour to try to sketch in for you what for me is, and in fact you don't have to be staring at me anymore, you can stare at something far more interesting than that while I talk. For me, a concept which is really, I call it SITOPIA, and I'll explain why later, but really it's a way of seeing the world through food. And it's something I came to after many years of trying to sort of make the architectural discourse about how we live somehow more to do with people and less to do with buildings. So in a way that does relate directly to what Sophia was just saying. But I come to think that actually food is not just an interesting lens for questioning how we live, but also understanding in a way how we got here, and therefore where we might be going in the future. And my favourite image, and one day I'm actually going to have the courage to only talk about this image for an hour, because it would be possible, but I'm not going to do that today. I've got about, how many have I got? 66 images for you today. Anyway, that's quite good for me. But it's a wonderful image. It shows the city of Siena in 1338. And in fact, if some of you know this mural, it actually sits on one of the walls of the town hall in Siena. And it's called The Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. And I remember going to see this beautiful room and these beautiful murals when I was an architecture student and thinking, oh, that's a nice image of Siena, and kind of wandering off somewhere else. And it was only about 20 or 30 years later when I came back and looked at it again that I thought, that's actually incredible. That is all about food. I'm just going to try to sort of explain what for me now is incredibly obvious, but that's because as I like to say, I sort of now see the world through food-shaped glasses. But I mean, blindingly obviously, on the left you've got the city, and on the right-hand side you've got the countryside. And of course, this is a symbiotic relationship that's so obvious and fundamental that it's kind of a bit weird that we don't think about it more often. And one of the things I want to talk about today is why we don't think about it more often. But nevertheless, here we have huntsmen leaving the city to go and maybe shoot a boar or something. Farmers working very diligently in the fields. Obviously a very highly manicured landscape, a landscape that's actually been modified to feed the city. And then coming in, a pig wandering in. You can see asses with bags of grain on their backs, flocks of sheep inside the city. In fact, the more you look, the more you pick up references to food. And really, as I say, this image sits on one side of the council chamber in Siena. By the way, on the other side is the allegory of the effects of bad government, which I don't have for you because it's largely been destroyed, but it's basically everything going to rack and ruin. But what's interesting is that the underlying message of this image is very, very simple. It's basically the city needs to look after the countryside, and then the countryside will look after the city, and you cannot have one without the other. And basically, good government makes sure that that balance is maintained, and that's really what it's all about. Now, as I say, I mean, sorry, is the sound okay? I'm just going to hold, is it fine and audible and everything? Good. Now, this, I mean, if you lived in Siena in the 14th century and you were sort of, as it were, sipping a glass of wine in the piazza, which, you know, actually there was evidence of people doing, you could look out across this landscape and you could really understand where your food came from. People wrote poetry about it. They wrote poetry about the wonderful wine and the wonderful countryside where it came from. But it's a unique moment in history, and again, later on, I'm going to explain quite why this is so unique. But if we think about if you like, the equivalent situation now, it's really very different. Now, you know, I don't have to tell this audience, I'm sure, that more than half the global population now lives in cities than lives in the countryside. We passed that point at roughly 2006. And I also don't have to tell this audience, I'm sure, that most of the food that we consume now doesn't come from a beautiful piece of manicured landscape, you know, just, you know, sort of outside your window, but really bizarre, actually, modified landscapes that can be as far away as the other side of the world, and very often are. And there are many things to say about this, but the predominant thing that I want to get across to you now is a concept that I've come to call the urban paradox. And the reason I call it the urban paradox is if you think about the dwelling problem, which, if you like, as an architect is my primary problem, you have to reconcile various needs that we've got as humans. On the one hand, we've got social needs. I mean, we need one another for many things. I mean, not least, you know, it'd be rather tragic if I was standing here talking to myself in an empty room. So, you know, we need one another, and we can only really become fully human with other people's cooperation. You know, man is a social animal, as Aristotle said. But the more we cluster together to be with one another and to be more than the sum of our parts, the further away we get from our sources of sustenance. And of course, this is an extreme example, but it's a very real example, and this is the way the world is going, so that we have enormous, if you like, metropolitan blobs, to use a technical term, on the left, such as Shanghai, and on the right we have landscapes which are quite extraordinary when you think about them, but, you know, modified landscapes which are highly technical. This one is growing soy, and of course soy is a booming crop, not least because we're actually not feeding ourselves only on grain anymore, but we're feeding grain to animals and then eating the animals. And so the soybean revolution that's going on globally is also to do with a soaring level of meat consumption that, again, I'll come to in a minute. But the point I want to really make here is that there is no ideal solution to the urban paradox. And the point is that you can't actually feed a city from within itself, because that's what the countryside does. And there's many, many ways. I mean, most of what I talk about for the next hour is actually going to be about this problem and different ways that it plays out in our lives. But the point is that, you know, there is no kind of one-size-fits-all solution. So what do we actually do about it? How do we sort of start to approach it? I find it very, very helpful, usually, as I said before, to find out how we got where we are as a way of working out how we might go forward. And in this case, how we got here is roughly a 10,000 year long story. So about 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, you have to imagine an area of the ancient Near East. It was actually the model for the Garden of Eden, as it happens in the Bible. But it was called, well, it's come to be called the Fertile Crescent, because it was a crescent-shaped area of fertile land, which naturally had occurring grasses in it, which were the modern, the sort of ancient antecedents of modern wheat and barley. And in this area, it's a long story, but basically our ancestors had fed themselves by hunting and gathering, so they'd been following their food around, if you like, sort of hunting or picking berries off trees. It was a sort of peripatetic existence. They had to move and follow their food around. But at the end of the last ice age, the ice moved north, leaving this area of fertile land, which had different kinds of foods available, and people gradually began to experiment with grass, eating grass, which nobody had ever tried to do before. And of course, eating grass is a very different proposition from eating berries off a tree, because the head of a piece of grass tends to become ripe at a critical moment. If you're not there to harvest it, it either blows away or a deer comes along and nibbles it instead of you. So you've got to be camped by it and make sure that you're in the right place at the right time when it's ripe. And these early farming settlements along the eastern Mediterranean seaboard and also in what is western Turkey now were very, very early settlements that began to experiment with not only harvesting grain, but then, of course, pounding it up into some kind of porridge to eat it, but then saving the seed and planting it back in the land, which, of course, was the beginning of what we now think of as agriculture. But the point is that, these settlements, which were static and far more static than human settlements had ever been before, they grew up around this new novel idea of eating grain. And gradually, as they evolved, they turned into a little group of sort of farming settlements, actually, down here in what is now modern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, that are generally thought of as the first cities ever built on Earth. So there's some very, very big messages here. The first is that cities and agriculture haven't actually been around for very long. Just the last 10,000 years in the form of agriculture and roughly 5,000 in terms of cities. So hugely short period in terms of the human story. But secondly, that cities and agriculture, and specifically the growing of grain, arable agriculture, co-evolved. They're absolutely symbiotically connected, and you cannot have one without the other. And in fact, grain is the only food we've ever discovered which is capable of feeding large static, i.e. urban populations. Now, what did those really early cities look like? Well, here's one of them. This is the city of Ur, a sort of partly filled out map from the first excavations that were done of it in the 1920s, and I've sort of annotated it a bit. I've added in the river, actually, which they didn't bother to put in, but it's very, very critical because Ur, and indeed any ancient city that we know of that grew to any size whatsoever, was founded on a river. And there are very, very good reasons for this, because if you think about farming as a way of feeding yourself, you need various things. Clearly, you need fertile soil. Well, very often the most fertile soil is around a river mouth. Secondly, you need a ready source of water to keep the soil irrigated. And in fact, what they did in Ur is every year when the floods came, they sent the water around into holding channels, and then they irrigated the farmland throughout the course of the year, sort of eking out the water supply. And last but not least, of course, it's a source of transportation. So you can actually move the food around, because if feeding a city is difficult in terms of knowing what the food is going to be, then moving it and actually getting into the city physically is another major issue. So all of these things come together in, what I like to call the first experiment in urban living on Earth, which is Ur. And if we look at it, we notice some interesting things. The first is that it's not very big. It's about 0.5 kilometre across. The second is that it's very dense. I mean, as I say, this is a partly filled out plan, but if you look at that little area of housing in there and just imagine all of this filled like that, that's what it was like. So it's extremely dense and compact. On a river, as I said, surrounded by its productive hinterland, so the farms are literally in this unexcavated area outside the city. fortified, and then last but not least dominated by this enormous temple complex, which was not only the spiritual centre of the city, but also the administrative centre. And what's really interesting, if you look at this Sumerian culture that evolved in ancient Mesopotamia, is that it's the first to invent writing. And in fact, the complexity of organising an annual harvest, which is the most convulsive moment in urban life, and the entire year was basically arranged around it, but the complexity of organising it, whose field was going to be harvested first and so on, required simply farming accounts to be made. And so writing was invented to deal with this hugely complex process. And in fact, the grain harvest was organised by the temple, as it turns out. So the temple not only organised spiritual events culminating in the harvest, but actually the act of gathering in the grain at harvest time, which was then offered up to the gods in the famous ziggurat of Ur, where the gods lived. And then the grain that the gods didn't eat, i.e. pretty much all of it, was stored in this large, difficult to see but that enormous building is a huge municipal granary. And then it was cooked in temple bakeries. In fact, Sir Leonard Woolley, who excavated said that, the temple complex represented more of a kitchen than a temple when he looked at it. And then it was distributed back to the people during the course of the year. So you could say that the first cities on Earth solved the problem of feeding themselves by organising themselves into a sort of city-state model, which is a city surrounded by productive hinterland, and by, in the middle, having what in modern terminology we would probably call a large, spiritualised food distribution hub. So that's how they did it. That, if you like, is Model A. Now, if we had several days, I could now take you through the plans of many, many other ancient cities that followed precisely this model. It's very prevalent. But you'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is go to the opposite end of the extreme. I'm going to show you an ancient city, the only one actually, which went the other way. And this was Rome. Now, why did Rome go so radically in the opposite direction? Or indeed, how did it do it? It actually had 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD, which is an extraordinary number. I mean, big, double the size of metropolitan Lisbon today, for instance. How on earth did a city this size manage to feed itself? Now, the interesting thing is that, again, as I say, everything sort of turns on its head with Rome, but it does sort of create a model that we're very familiar with today. I'm sure you've all heard of food miles. In fact, I think I might have already mentioned them when I was talking about the urban paradox. The interesting thing is that they're not new. And in fact, if you look at Rome, and here is a map that I've actually pieced together from various pieces of evidence that I've come across about where Rome's food was coming from at the height of the empire. And it's mind-boggling where the food is coming from. I mean, where wasn't it coming from? Lisbon, which was a thriving city even then, and I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute, exported garum or liquamen, which is a very sought-after fermented fish sauce, a bit like modern nampla, if any of you know that delicious Thai fish sauce. But the critical food, of course, to feed a city like Rome was grain. And the most interesting thing, really, if you sort of study the geography of the empire, is that the very early conquests were Sicily and Sardinia, which were very rich grain-growing regions. And very early on, the city was already importing its grain from those. And then when it grew a bit bigger and that wasn't enough, it waged war on Carthage and successfully defeated it. That was very important because, of course, Carthage was a rival not only militarily, but also for food, and got its paws on Carthage's grain productive capacity. And then when even that wasn't enough, it finally moved down and famously conquered Egypt. And Egypt really became the grain basket of Rome. And in fact, 6,000 farmers were sailed down to farm the Nile Valley, supported by a huge military backup. And the Alexandrian grain ships, which followed this route into Rome, were effectively the supertankers of their day. And they were very anxiously awaited because, interestingly, Rome only ever had about 2 weeks' worth supply of food in it. So the feeding of the people was really difficult. It was the biggest burden. Tacitus called it the biggest burden that the city faced. He also said, famously, that Augustus won the people over with grain. because up to a third of the citizens were fed on a state grain dole. And when Egypt was successfully defeated, so securing the grain supplies, that made Augustus almost undefeatably popular with the people. So you look at this landscape and you say, okay, bread from here, olive oil from the North African coast, also from Hispania, wine, of course, delicious ham from Gaul, yum yum, honey from the Black Sea. You know, I mean, you just have to see Rome as this great belly kind of, you know, sucking in food from all over the place. Even at one point, oysters from London. And this is even before you get into all of the exotica and peacock's tongues and zebra flanks that, you know, they got into when they started to lose the plot towards the end of the empire. Anyway, so again, there's some very, very basic lessons we can learn from this. One is that the only way a city the size of Rome could possibly have fed itself was by having access to the sea. Why? Because not only did it give it access to much bigger grain-growing regions than it had access to on its doorstep, but also simply physically transporting that much grain would have been completely impossible. It was about 50 times cheaper to transport food over water than over land in the pre-industrial era, which is why only cities that had access to the sea could really grow to any considerable size. So that, in a nutshell, sort of tells you in a way that, you know, in some senses, lots has changed since Rome tried to feed itself. In other senses, nothing has changed. And in fact, I have given entire lectures just on the food system of ancient Rome. And it's amazing how many things you can relate to that we also suffer from now were going on then. Anyway, I mustn't allow myself to talk any more about Rome. It's one of my favourite topics. So moving on, there's a sort of really interesting question about what then is the relationship between a city and its productive hinterland. And the first person to really sort of address this in any detail was a German geographer and landowner called Johann von Thünen. He wrote a book in 1826 called The Isolated State. And the isolated state was defined as a fertile, featureless, ubiquitous plain, inhabited only by logical, profit-seeking farmers. So I quite often say it's a bit like the Netherlands. But anyway, that's represented by this diagram on the left here. And he said, if a city sat within this just basically flat farmland, how would its productive hinterland naturally develop? And he said, well, obviously you'd have market gardening on the city fringes because fruit and vegetables are very difficult to transport. So you want them close to the city, they go off very easily, they squash very easily. Secondly, they're a luxury food because they were a luxury food in the pre-industrial world. And so you need farmers to be able to get big enough profits from selling the food to afford the high land rents close to the city. So market gardening. Then he said you would have about 20 or 30 kilometres of grain production because, of course, grain is the most important food of the city. But it's so heavy and bulky that you can't move it very far. So actually, beyond about 30 kilometres, there's an economic limit. It simply would not be economic to bring the grain in, and therefore that limits the size to which the city can grow. And the only food that can come in easily from further afield is livestock. So you have grazing for livestock far away because the animals, of course, can walk into the city, so they provide their own transport. So basically the hinterland can expand. But because grain is the most important food, it's that which determines the size to which the city can grow. Now, Johann von Thünen was a German, so he didn't have that huge kind of maritime imagination. But the only, well, which is interesting, isn't it? But the only thing the only concession that he made to geography, if you like, was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, then obviously it could grow a lot bigger because its food regions, as it were, could come from a lot further away because it was so much easier to bring the food in by water. Now I remember being lectured on this when I was an architecture student and snoozing at the back thinking, gosh, this is unbelievably boring. I hadn't sort of had the food bulb by then go off in my head. But of course it is much more interesting if you relate it to real places and real cities. Now, just to sort of keep you all awake if you're going to snooze off, I've got a little quiz here. Here are 4 very famous cities on rivers. Can any of you tell me which any of them are? That one, for instance. Okay, you passed. That's good. Any idea where that is? Can you see it well enough? Yes, gentleman in the front, your prize is awaiting you outside later. That one? Very good. Somebody down here is good at this. And last but not least, yeah, that always foxes people. It's interesting. That's the Yangtze, and that's Shanghai. Interesting, isn't it? So, I mean, as I say, that's just a kind of visual, you know, thanks Google, kind of, you know, confirmation of what I was saying about the importance of rivers to cities and, of course, to geography as a whole. Now, the interesting thing about some of these cities, and Lisbon is one, is that they combine the advantages, if you like, of being at the mouth of a very important river. Now, I have to look at my notes to try to remind myself how you say this. Teju. Roughly? Okay. Look at it. It's huge. I mean, it's the biggest river on the Hispanic plain. And no wonder Lisbon, perched at the bottom of it, was a Neolithic city already trading in food, salt and so on, long before the Romans came. And then, of course, when the Romans did come, that just exacerbated. And, of course, it's got this beautiful site at the mouth, but also in a protected harbour. So we have the combined effects of riverine trade, but also maritime trade. And if you look at, and there's beautiful, I was just actually in the museum of the Ciudad just now, fantastic images of the early city. But of course, you know, they all, as it were, show it from the water and with all these ocean-going vessels. It's no surprise, really, that Lisbon was a very successful city because of its geography, but also that its entire history is bound up with trade. And not only, of course, trade to do with actually the city feeding itself, but also trade to do with the city feeding lots of other cities. And of course, you know, it's a very international history. But what's interesting is, I mean, what I've discovered when I've been looking at the relationship between food and cities in history is that if you look closely, you can begin to sort of map together, if you like, the way the city was fed, because it's kind of, the evidence is actually already there in these kinds of representations. So obviously, any city that has ocean-going vessels is going to have an international trade going, and it's going to find it very easy to feed itself. What's interesting about Lisbon is that most cities, a bit like which I showed you a bit earlier, tended to focus the business of food, in other words, the marketplace and stuff, in the middle. Now, interesting, Lisbon doesn't do that. Lisbon actually combines its international trade with its actually the feeding of itself. So if we look at this, now I completely can't remember how you're supposed to pronounce this space, but anyway, let me give it a go, and you can laugh in ridicule. The Tejado do Paso. Roughly. Anyway, so there, that place. If you look at that, that's not only overseen by the most important building, the Ribeira Palace, but which is obviously fortified, and the shipbuilding and arsenal are behind, so you have the civic power, but also this is the civic granary, the granary building. So the corn coming in, the most important thing, is also being protected, and it's also very accessible. And then next to that you have the fish and vegetable markets. So really you've got a little kind of militarized, you know, civically represented kind of food market, sort of, you know, the modern equivalent of a supermarket, but absolutely slap bang in the heart of everything else that's going on in the city. And also, of course, increasingly, as Lisbon becomes an international centre for trade, exotic sugars and spices and so on as well. So, I mean, here's the earliest existing map. Keep being worried that I should be sounding like this. Is that better? Yeah. But it was audible before, yes? Good. So now you're all going to get... Anyway, this is the earliest map known, apparently, about Portuguese conquests in the Age of Discovery. And it's completely fascinating if you just imagine, you know, what the discovery of the Spice Islands and India did for the way people ate, but also their sort of relationship with food. Again, you know, interestingly, this global relationship with food is not new. It's been there for as long as people had the courage to get in a ship and sail off somewhere else. And there's just a close-up of that sort of, you know, as I say, because I see everything with food-shaped glasses on, I just look at this and I just see food everywhere. But it's completely fascinating, you know, the smaller fishing smacks tied up, They've just begun to show sort of market stalls and so on. There's kind of military stuff going on there, and then international trade in this fenced-off area, and then a fortified granary. I mean, it really is a very, very powerful configuration. Interestingly, in the museum I literally just went to, I saw there's also an image of food being sold in the Rossio. So this was also a market, as you would expect, because it's also a large open space. And often the markets were the only open spaces in cities, but also, critically, they were sort of the places of civic importance, not just because food was important to the city, but also because this idea of, the civic order, a bit like I was talking about in the first cities on earth in that to be seen to be in control of this incredibly important trade of food was also very important. So you have a sort of symbolic control as well as a real control of this most important of trades. And there we have a sort of image of it. And of course, as ever, the food thing is kind of both visible and invisible. So we have sort of military operations going on. But also, if you look to the left, you can see people sort of dressed in sailor's kit, sort of weighing up sort of bottles of wine and running off to the harbour with them. So the sort of the food and military elements of this space are sort of being represented together. Now, of course, I don't have to tell anyone here that a terrible thing happened in 1755. But it's interesting, after the earthquake, the rebuilding and everything, this, I think, incredibly enlightened, amazing vision for the city to replace this devastated city that happened after the earthquake and tsunami. He actually has the great good sense, Pombal, to sort of put back in essence what was there before, but just kind of straighten it out a bit. So we still have the Plazo de Comercio or something, roughly. You see, it's impossible. Can we do it later? I'll have a little lesson. But also, the space that was the Rossio is sort of represented. And kind of life goes on as normal, really. It's just more regularised. So you can still kind of see the geography of food in Lisbon, but maybe a bit more obscure than, for instance, in a city like London, where the medieval structure is still extant, right in the middle. But the important thing I want to say with all of this, really, is that, even a city like Lisbon, which is hugely maritime, found it incredibly easy to feed itself, fed other cities, indeed, it found it so easy, it was still limited in size by the fundamental difficulty of transporting the food back and into the hinterland of the city. So really all of the main trade was still focused around this harbour and the very important civic space of the market. And that is true of every pre-industrial city on Earth, basically. And it only really changes when this thing comes along. And I love this image because this is an image of the first ever railway built. It was the Liverpool to Manchester railway. It was only about 30 miles long. And it was built to literally take coal, sea coal, from the port of Liverpool to the growing industrial town of Manchester. And you can see that very important transport going on at the top. But what you can also see, which I love, is what they were also carrying on this new thing were farm animals. And of course, this changes everything, because up until this point, as I hope I've persuaded you a little bit in any case, cities were effectively limited by geography. They had to rely on rivers for transport or the sea if they wanted to grow beyond a certain size. Food travelled into the city visibly and physically and was overseen by the civic authorities. And it was extremely, it was the most important thing any city had to face. Whereas when the railways come in, that gets turned on its head, and three fundamental things change. The first is cities are emancipated from geography. They can be built any size, any shape, and anywhere. The second is food starts to become invisible. Instead of animals walking into market and literally being there in front of you and slaughtered in front of you, indeed, they start to travel down specialised routes and arrive as dead meat in the city rather than as a live animal. And last but not least, city authorities that had always taken very great care to control the food system suddenly don't bother anymore because they think, oh, thank goodness, these new food industries are so good at this, we don't have to worry anymore. Phew, kind of thing. So these are really fundamental things that still completely affect the way we feed ourselves today. Here's the growth of London. Here's London just before the railways came. It's more or less still the size of the medieval city. 60 years later and 30 years after that, it's turned into what I call metropolitan splurge. You couldn't possibly feed a city like this from one or two little markets that you walked to in the middle somewhere, which this city still was. So that's an immense change over a very, very short time. Secondly, as cities like London expand, and of course London expanded far quicker than Lisbon did at this point because basically Britain was industrialised, so you know all the railways were happening there as opposed to anywhere else faster. And as people moved into the cities, I mentioned this before, demand for meat began to soar because people were demanding high-protein diets. They were working in factories, really long hours, 12 hours a day, doing really physical work, rather than working in fields, which, although it was physical work, was periodic, and people could lie down and rest when they wanted to, whereas in the factory, you literally had to keep going. So soaring demand for meat, coupled with the railways in places like Australia or in South America and America, making marginal grasslands, which had previously been completely inaccessible, economically accessible for growing grain, grain being the food of cities, as I keep repeating. Although, interestingly, here the change was there was so much grain all of a sudden, which was easily accessible, that people had the bright idea of, well, instead of feeding it to people, let's feed it to animals, and then we can sell them the animals. So cheap meat, basically on the back of the discovery of how to transport grain around very, very cheaply. Of course, the result of that was that all of these marginal grasslands, which had perennial grass, which kept the organic matter in the soil, were ploughed up to create monocultural grain crops. Of course, you know, I'm sure you all know about the Dust Bowl in the 1920s and 30s when there was a series of disastrously dry years, drought years, and literally the topsoil just blew off and took off in these black dust storms, and the whole of the middle of America was decimated. It's actually never recovered its fertility from this terrible event. And other signs that maybe this wasn't such a great idea as well. There was a very famous expose of the Chicago Union stockyards that I just showed you by Upton Sinclair, written in 1906, exposing the appalling conditions in which the animals were kept and also the workers were kept. There are about 17 million animals going through this place every year and about 60,000 workers, and conditions were appalling. It's really the beginning of the sort of industrial visibility of food and the first really famous expose of what was really going on. And the interesting thing was there was a complete crisis. People stopped eating ground beef, which is what all of these industrial workforces were actually mainly living off. And there's an interesting response, which again may seem familiar to you, but a group of hamburger joints called White Tower came up with a brilliant idea of styling themselves as if they were pure and dependable. So they start building these kind of literally white, clean, white-tiled hamburger joints, as if to say, look, I'm really clean and fresh and lovely. Trust me, please, you know. So, and this is also really interesting in terms of, if you like, the modern food industry and how it tends to react to similar crises, which I'll come on to later. So as I say, there were very early signs that this industrial model had problems, but of course, you know, there's nothing stopping the growth of the city, and after railways, we got cars creating extraordinary landscapes like this one. Something like 10 million homes built along these models just after the Second World War in America, where the whole idea was you were so far away from your neighbour that you didn't need a fence, you know. So that's a really good use of fertile farmland, isn't it? And then, of course, you don't walk anywhere in a landscape like this, so you get in a car and you drive off to a box somewhere on the outskirts of the town where the supermarkets are. Supermarkets, of course, being invented, again, in the sort of the modern food logistics, not to come into the middle of a city, but to deliver food to the edge. And of course, you don't talk to a human being anymore like you do in a market, but you are presented with a series of packets of food that kind of talk to you, as it were. And you go, oh, you look delicious. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You drive home again, and she's thinking, when on earth did I buy all this stuff? I only went out for a carrot. And then she's going to stick it all in the fridge in the corner and wait for it to go off, because, of course, she's got absolutely no idea what she's bought or what's in any of those packets. And it's really the beginning of the complete divorce from food that we have now. And I'm skipping through quite a lot of fascinating cultural stuff, but it's a big story to try to sort of fill in just an hour. Anyway, as I say, if you think about it, supermarkets, which were explicitly invented to exclude the human from the transaction of buying and selling food, this was the whole logic. They, of course, don't come into cities, as I said, but they sit on the edge and we go out to the food. So it's this curious reversal. I often say supermarkets are anti-urban. They're the very opposite of the whole logic around which cities evolved, which is places of exchange, and the main thing they were exchanging was food. So it's kind of odd, and you certainly don't speak to people in there unless you're weird. And of course, we then have, all trying to pick someone up, which apparently they're very good for. It's never worked for me, but anyway, there you go. You know, you get landscapes like this. Now, this is a recent map that was done of the city of New York. That's Manhattan, gentleman spotted earlier. This is the Bronx and Harlem, i.e. the poor parts. And that's East Brooklyn, also poor. And guess what? These areas are what is known as a food desert, which is areas where people live more than half a kilometre from a source of fresh food. Why are poor areas in cities food deserts? Because basically we have a food system now which adjusts itself according to market forces, and basically the food goes where the money is, not where people are. So poor people just don't get served at all. So that's what I call the eviscerated city, the food literally leaving the middle of the city and going elsewhere. And we have an industrialized food culture, again, with, you know, appalling and increasingly visible effects, eating all of this denatured food, which has been denatured so that it can withstand these incredibly long distribution chains. Of course, it's incredibly bad for us. Our bodies can't absorb it, so we get fatter and fatter. We then try to counter that with idiotic diets. This one involved us eating meat and fat all day long, and the guy who invented it dropped dead while he was jogging, weighing about, you know, I mean, you know, it's so kind of crazy. And then there's an increasing group of people, particularly the Japanese actually, that believe that we can't digest food properly unless we have a daily shot of probiotic yogurt. So people like Yakult are making absolute mint, sort of delivering emergency yogurt to people who panic if they don't get, you know, I mean, really. Squeamishness, which is, do you know what squeamishness is? No. It's quite kind of English and American, it would seem. It's kind of fear and disgust mingled at the idea of kind of anything. You know, so if you cut yourself, it's blood, you know, a bit like that. But the interesting thing that it plays into the food system, because we won't eat certain bits of the animal in the UK. This is absolutely notorious. We won't eat even, you know, I mean, they've started, sorry, this is so outrageous, I have to now tell you. They started taking the bones out of legs of lamb, because people don't want to think this was once an animal that stood up and therefore had scaffolding in it when it walked along. So you can't buy a leg of lamb with a bone in it now. I mean, it's bonkers. And we don't eat the black meat of a chicken because of the black meat, as we call it in the UK, is the sort of the wings and the legs, and you can see, kind of sinews and, I mean, this is me aping how the English respond. So we export it to Thailand, where actually they prefer the black meat, and they send their breasts back to us because we only really like the breasts because it doesn't look like an animal. You might as well have grown it in a factory. So this is all the effects of squeamishness. But I only show you this because this is a new kind of ready meal, because 1 in 3 meals in the UK is. Sorry, I should sort of backtrack for myself and say that this industrialized food culture, its mothership, if you like, is America. And its satellite little baby mothership is England, Britain, where I come from. And then this sort of thing is kind of going global. So you're kind of doing pretty well in Portugal at the moment, as Sophia said in her introduction. Only 20% waste is actually good. In America, it's 50%. You know, so, and of course, as we know, things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and so on are they're world leaders in America, and we're following along. So I'm kind of here as a sort of weird warning, I suppose, amongst everything else. And the waste thing we have just, in fact, talked about, but what I should tell you is that this delicious-looking cornucopia of vegetables was actually filmed by taking, all of this came out of a supermarket dumper bin and was then photographed to see, to show what supermarkets throw away, because of course they outsource huge amounts, about a third of their fruit and vegetables before it even gets into the supermarket because it doesn't conform. And then they have their sell-by dates, which nobody understands. And when the food reaches it, it gets binned. And it's perfectly edible. So that's, if you like, certain things about the industrialized food culture. Globally, what is this food system doing to us? Well, it's devastating the planet. About 20% of global arable land is now degraded because of this kind of monocultural production on marginal land, so it's Dust Bowl happening all over again. About 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to farming and the deforestation associated with it. About 70% of global freshwater is engaged in farming for irrigation, and most of that is not renewable. In other words, it's aquifers and rivers and so on that are ancient water. They'll never be replaced. I don't have to explain to you that we have a problem with population. About a third, so I talked a little bit earlier about the diet transition which is happening because as people move into cities, they're demanding more meat, and that is continuing now. So as we have a projection that double the number of people are going to be living in cities by 2050, we also have a projection that double the amount of meat and dairy is going to be consumed. So we're on a radical curve here. And if I tell you that a third of the global grain harvest is now fed to animals, and that it takes 10 times as much grain to feed us if it's been through an animal first, you get some idea of at least one aspect of how ecologically damaging that is. If I also tell you that we're spending 10 calories of energy for every calorie of food we consume in this industrial model, you see how crazy that is and how it's bound to change when peak oil comes anyway. And last but not least, there's 1.4 million rural dwellers currently leaving the countryside for the city every week globally. So, and I could go on scaring you with more of these statistics. I've got plenty more of them, but I mean, just to give you some idea of, you know, the fundamental situation that we're facing with the global food system that we've currently got. What's interesting about all of that is that none of it is actually accounted for in the cost of the food that we buy. So we have this illusion of cheap food, which, by the way, doesn't exist and never has existed. I mean, probably the nearest you can get to it is, you know, if you literally live in a very verdant jungle and you can pluck a banana off a tree, great, that's kind of cheap food, if you like. But most food that we eat is the reverse. And there was a study done in India that reckoned that if you internalized the true costs of one hamburger made from beef raised on land recently cleared of rainforest, and you factored in all the pollution, eutrophication, peak oil, loss of biodiversity, obesity, and so on, which is related to this kind of diet, we should be charging $200 for a hamburger and not $2. So it just gives you some idea of how unequal that playing field is. And it's a question of value, ultimately. And where that leaves us when the world, and this really should scare you, because the world is moving towards the Western diet for many, many reasons. I mean, the most interesting reason, actually, and this never fails to fascinate me when I sort of repeat it and think about it, this diet, which evolved in America, was actually, I mean, I call it the lowest common denominator diet, i.e. it's a diet which offends nobody. And how it evolved was in the 19th century when lots of European settlers were going to America, and they had, if you like, if they were Hungarian, they had paprika in their food, and if they were Italian, they had garlic and so on. And they went over to America, and all the yummy bits of their food were the bits that all their neighbours went, you know, don't like that, thanks. So all the interesting stuff got taken out. And of course, the only 3 flavour enhancers that nobody objects to are salt, sugar, and fat. So great, you know, my food doesn't taste of anything anymore, so let's just stick all this in. And of course, the one thing that there was in America that wasn't in 19th century Europe was lots of meat, as I've already explained. So fantastic, let's have lots of that as well. And it is the American diet. It's going global because there's a huge amount of money to be made from selling people this kind of food. As I say, nobody seems to object to it. And thirdly, it's completely out of control because most of the companies that control the modern food system are bigger than national governments because it's just gone completely unregulated. There's a huge amount of what's called consolidation within the global food industry, which means that you have 1 or 2 or 3 companies that control something like 60 to 90% of grain is just 3 companies control 60 to 90% of global trade in grain. So this is what I call my Armageddon slide, my scariest slide. Things do get better after this. But the really big question, of course, is what are we going to do about it? And I can see I'm going to have to speed up to ask that. But anyway, one crumb of comfort, this is not a new question. And in fact, I think, as I've probably indicated by now, feeding cities has never been easy. So, in fact, we've got thousands of years of backtrack knowledge of people thinking about this problem. When Plato wrote his Republic, one of the things that he noted is, of course, you would have to limit the size to which a city could grow, otherwise it wouldn't be able to feed itself. Kind of no-brainer. He came from Athens. Athens was a polis. The polis was a city-state. It recognized the importance of its productive hinterland. He, interestingly, limits the size to which a city would ideally grow to about 30,000. Which, interestingly, is a figure that gets picked up again in other utopian thinkers, such as Thomas More on the left and Ebenezer Howard. I often say that Garden Cities is a bit like Thomas More with railways, but basically Thomas More wrote a critique of London in the 16th century, and he said London was absorbing too much of the nutrients from the rest of the country, and he posited, actually this is interesting thinking about it, he posited a fantasy island, which was stumbled upon by, and this is the interesting bit I suddenly think being in Lisbon, a Portuguese sailor. So that's a Portuguese ship there, stumbling on this island and describing what he found. And what he found was an island full of semi-independent city-states of limited size, arranged in a kind of loose network about one day from one another. And he said, you know, the incredible thing about Utopia, this island, is that everybody's absolutely obsessed with farming. It's the only thing that men, women and children do is farm. So there's a huge sort of theme of food in the undercurrent there. And I find it fascinating if you look at Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities of Tomorrow, another utopian attempt to address the huge burgeoning of cities that he saw and was increasingly worried about in his own day, about 100 years ago. He also said we have to limit the size to which cities can grow, and then we sort of have productive hinterland around them, but we can arrange them, of course. Railways had come in now in a network so that there's enough density of population that you get the benefits of civilization, which he defined as being able to rustle up a decent symphony orchestra, which I think is a pretty good definition of civilization. So that's one way people have thought about how to solve the problem, if you like. Now, Howard even got to build one of these things, but actually all his industrial backers pulled out of the most important part, which was the farmland, and they just ended up sort of building pretty suburbia. So basically, if you say Garden City to people now, they think, oh, that's all those lovely little cottages out in the country, isn't it? They don't think of the most radical proposal for incremental land reform I know of, which is interesting. Another guy who, if you like, had the alternative view was Frank Lloyd Wright, very famous architect, built the Guggenheim in New York and so on. He said, look, this city thing just isn't working at all. We've got to stop building them. He called cities cankerous tumours on the face of the planet. And he said we have to just stop building them, destroy the ones we've got, and go back to the land, basically. And this is his unambitious plan to cover the whole of America with family farms. In houses designed by him, obviously, you got a choice of about 5. And then, you know, basically everyone had sort of discovered, he said, the only hope for mankind is for him to rediscover his inner agrarian. In other words, you'll have to become farmers again. What if you get a bit lonely? No problem, because everyone would have a helicopter, designed also by Frank Lloyd Wright, and so you just fly anywhere you wanted, basically. In other words, it doesn't work. And that is the problem with utopia, as we discover. Now, there's a group of people now arguing that the city is mankind's salvation, and we all have to basically move into cities and pull up the drawbridge. And what I find fascinating about this, I mean, it's a really provocative stance. But interestingly, in this book, I mean, Stuart Brand, who's completely changed tune and says we've just got to employ every piece of technology we need, and upset a lot of his followers because he used to basically be your kind of back to nature guy. He at least deals with the food problem, but his view of it is we've got to just do the technology, do the GM, do the vertical farms, do the whole lot. Interestingly, Edward Glaser, who wrote a book called The Triumph of the City, doesn't even mention food. So for him, it's just he's not even seeing the problem. Anyway, my problem with this is that if you work out, I mean, now vertical farms, I'm sure many of you have heard of. If you actually work out, well, provided we can make them work, which of course is also still on the drawing board, but if you work out how many farms it would take to feed London, my home city, even if we stopped eating meat, because I don't happen to think it's ethical to have animals in tower blocks, that's just my view, you would need 100 metres by 100 metres and 30 stories high, 2,000 vertical farms. That's even if you can work out how to make the energy work when you're replicating soil and light and so on. And I often say, you know, I mean, Le Corbusier, I don't know whether there are any architects in the audience. Are there actually? Hands up? Oh, not many. Oh, I should have found out who you were earlier. People working in food. Gosh, who are you? Interesting. Anyway, we'll have to talk later. Anyway, it's a general audience, which is wonderful. That's what we want. Basically, Le Corbusier did a plan. He basically said, you know, we have to stop building kind of higgledy-piggledy cities and house people in tower blocks. This is his vision for the centre of Paris. That's Notre Dame. And I often say, well, actually, if you really took the vertical farm thing seriously, that's Paris. Great. I don't think I want to live there or indeed go there on a weekend anymore. And this is really my point about utopia. It doesn't work. And in fact, the word tells you that it doesn't work because it's a joke word. In fact, Thomas More deliberately used it as a joke. It can either mean a good place or no place. It's got a double derivation. And I remember researching utopia for my book and thinking that's incredibly depressing because utopia is the closest thing we've got to a multidisciplinary tradition of thinking about how we should live. And if you can't have it, that's terrible. What do we do? But by then, I'd spent 7 years thinking about food. And through food, I thought, well, we do actually already live in SITOPIA, which is a word that I invented. It means food place. And basically, you know, sitos is the Greek word for food. And I just thought, you know, isn't it interesting? Actually, most utopian visions talk endlessly about food anyway. They're the kind of solving the food problem, but they don't really state it directly. And then they sort of just get distracted by architecture or something. But how would it be if we really said, look, we live in a world shaped by food. How about if we take food and we use it as a tool and a collaborative way of thinking and acting to shape the world differently? What would that be like? Well, what would it be like? Well, as I say, I have started to see food everywhere and see the world through food. And what I see is that food flows through our lives. And a gentleman interviewing me just now sort of said, but you never talk about water. And I said, it's all about water because, of course, we're 90% water. Food is 90% water. It's all about water. So whenever I say food, think water, if you would, and save me the trouble of going food and water every time I say food. Anyway, it's a flow like water, and it flows from the countryside through some distribution channel most of us never see, into a market or a supermarket, into our kitchens if we cook, which, as I say, in the UK often we don't, onto our tables where the kids throw it on the floor, they don't like it probably, and then into the waste system, and round it goes. That's unbelievably simplistic, although it does represent to an extent what happens. Of course, it's really much more complex. The sound guys are going to be happy because I'm not going to take this off, so there'll be no more interference. It's much more complex because every stage of that journey is affected by every other stage and affects every other stage through what in this diagram are blue arrows, but are in reality opinions, markets, beliefs, preferences, rituals, you name it, everything. It's a hugely complex web that's so complex that you may as well call it culture, to be perfectly honest, not even just food culture, but culture. And that's the only way to really understand what we're dealing with. And that's why I love this book called Hungry Planet, which I didn't write, but two wonderful journalists called Peter Menzel and Faith D'Alessio did. And they went round the world interviewing families and asking them to sort of stand by a pile of the amount of food that they would eat in a week and what they would eat in a week, and then just talk about, you know, whether they ate together or whether they cooked, and then that's set against a whole series of statistics about that particular country, birth rates, death rates, and how many McDonald's there are in every town, sort of thing. And it's completely fascinating because I realised if you look at these images, you can tell from, you know, this pile of industrialized awfulness that this very charming looking American family are eating and living on, or for instance, this beautiful cornucopia of freshness that this Egyptian family, and it's a much bigger family, you'll notice as well, which is significant, of course. You can extrapolate all sorts of things. You can extrapolate what kind of landscape that diet is going to produce. Are we going to, if we do eat meat, which some of you may disagree with, and I hope we can come on to talk about that, why not eat meat such as cows, that it can eat grass, that then stabilizes the landscape, and we can then eat the cows? That seems to me to be a sensible way of going about it. Doing what we're actually doing, and here we have a concentrated animal feeding operation. That's 160,000 cows that you can't see because the image is from so high up, walking around in their own shit, eating grain and being pumped full of antibiotics. That's how you produce cheap meat today. Now, it's obviously more expensive, quote unquote, to produce meat that way than this way, but actually if you factor in, as I was saying before, all the hidden costs, it isn't. Meat is expensive. Buying and selling. Sorry, I just got a little bit cross then. It's interesting, isn't it? I am underneath quite cross probably. Anyway, but I'm also an optimist. You know, how do we buy and sell food? You know, do we have the social capital of food being in the middle of the city, being celebratory, being seasonal, and actually having to do with humans, having a chat to one another? Or do we just sort of outsource it to these soulless boxes at the side of the city as if it's just about efficiency and nothing else? Do we have people who know how to cook? Now, as I said, you're not as badly off in Portugal as we are in the UK. Lucky you, but I'm here, like, as a, think of me as an angel of doom hovering on a... yeah. You know, honestly, if you don't protect your food culture, this is what's going to happen to you. We have... I think there's 7 out of 10 kids under the age of 20 saying that they never cook from scratch. 1 in 3 meals in the UK is a ready meal. We have an expression, knowing your onions, which basically means she can look at a pile of raw ingredients and actually know what they are. And I don't know whether you've heard of Jamie Oliver, have you, some of you? Oh, you all have? Amazing, okay. He's everywhere. Anyway, he's good. There was an amazing program. He took some raw vegetables like that, leeks, carrots, and so on, into a kid's classroom and held them up and said, who knows what this is? There was a leek, and they're all kind of going, no idea. They'd never even seen a raw potato before in their lives. These are 10 and 11-year-old kids. I mean, it really is terrifying. So we're running out of people like this. They don't have to be women, and they don't have to wear silly pinnies, but we do need cooks. Because if we don't have cooks, we can't have markets. And if we don't have cooks, we can't have food being loved and cared about. I mean, this is a real family, by the way. I was amazed. Look at the look on the face of the dog. You know, but this is what happens when you really, really treasure and value food and spend a long time. Okay, not all of us necessarily want to do this every day, but actually, when the kids eat with their parents, there's so many stats that say how much better off they are, their attention span's better, they're better at sharing, they do better at school, and they're less likely to get fat. I mean, it's just all in one. So 43% in America of families now eat together, and that stat is falling, whereas 1 in 5 meals, 19% of meals in America now is eaten in a car. Yeah. Isn't that amazing and terrifying? And then you think, where are we going with society? What kind of society are we creating if this is how much we care about food? That you can't even spend enough time to eat because you're too busy going somewhere else. So it's a really huge question. And of course, waste, as we talked about at the beginning, waste. Victor Hugo, by the way, if any of you have heard of Les Miserables, I'm sure you have. Have you? Yeah. I promise you this is amazing. 1,000 pages in, there's a 60-page long essay on sewers in Les Miserables, because Victor Hugo was completely obsessed with the amount of nutrients that Paris was flushing away in its very efficient sewage system. And he said the sewer is a cynic, it sees everything. And what he meant by that was the sewer shows you what society doesn't value. So it's very powerful. Of course, this is an image from the Second World War. when every street in London had a pig food bin at the end of it. You put your scraps into the bin, and then the bin was fed to the pig, and then you eat the pig. There is a reason why we've co-evolved with pigs and chickens for thousands of years. They're omnivores, we can feed their scraps to them, and then we can eat them. I mean, it's a bit sad at the end, but up to that, it's a very happy relationship. Anyway, now, there's many, many ethical issues to do with every aspect of the food system. My challenge, I suppose, to anyone I talk to, and I think it's something I do literally constantly now, is say, which of these ways of doing stuff, and there's millions more I haven't got time to tell you about, actually results in my idea of a good life? And not just what I'm doing, but what the people producing the food I'm eating, what their life is like, or if you like, the animals I'm eating, what their life is like, and so on and so on. So it's hugely complex, as I say, but that's really the question we're asking. The question we're asking is not, how do we feed the world? That's an idiotic, stupid question. It makes me also quite cross. I'm not cross, really, but I mean, you know, it's stupid. The question surely has to be, what is a good life? And then how do we feed that good life? So it's a much bigger question. Food fits into it. Now, I told you about consolidation in the food industry earlier. This is what I really mean. I mean that millions of producers and millions of consumers, and in fact this is based on a study in Europe where there were 3 million producers in 6 countries and 160 million consumers and 110 supermarket buying desks controlling that relationship. That's the power of consolidation and what the supermarkets can do. Now, there's a very famous essay about cities called "A City is Not a Tree," and my argument is if a city isn't a tree, then nor is a food system, nor should it be. So what we need to do is this. Now, this is just a diagram, I do realise that, but it's an important one to understand. If you want to do something about this, to me, completely unacceptable stroke scary level of power that certain people in the food industry have, you simply have to make new connections that cut them out of the picture. That really, in essence, is what the new food movement, which is going global, is doing. Now, again, there are many, many examples of how to do that, and I'm just going to tell you a few. But there's a very interesting concept that I think, you know, talks about a lot of them, which is from Carlo Petrini, who co-founded Slow Food. Have you heard of him or of it? Yeah. Somebody was applauding. Absolutely. I mean, Carlo Petrini, he has this concept of co-producing food, and I think it's really powerful. What he says is, yes, we live in this kind of weird industrialized world and so on, but that doesn't mean that we have to simply sit there passively and receive food as if we're kind of, you know, helpless blobs with a tube stuck in our mouths. We can actually go out and we can meet producers halfway, and we can care about what they do, and we can actually help them physically, you know. So this is one great example. This has actually been going for 40 years. It's called the Park Slope Food Co-op. It's in Brooklyn, in the United States, and actually a lot of my examples are from America because things got so bad there that people started doing the alternative earlier. So this has all been going on since the 70s. So that's the good side about food in America. Anyway, basically the idea is that a group of people get together and they just do direct deals with farmers. And it began with a couple of hippies in the 1970s, as I say. They've now got 30,000 members. You do 4 hours work a month. So it's run by everyone who is a member. But in exchange for that, you get your food about a third to a half cheaper than it would be in a traditional supermarket. And as you can see, it looks very much like a supermarket. And they do long-term ethical deals with local farmers. So they basically work with the farmers and they have regular meetings to say what they're going to, you know, stock and what they're not. And it's very moral because she's turning up late for her shift and he's saying, no, sorry, you know, should have been there, you're out. So it's a really fascinating model. One way of co-producing, if you like. Of course, if you're going to do that, then starts to make sense to map the local area and say, okay, you know, what can I produce more locally and seasonally? What's physically possible? This is a study done recently by Urban Design Lab of New York's urban food shed, as they call it, which of course goes back to the geography. City like Lisbon, on a major river basin. You know, there's actually a lot of fertile land around Lisbon. What can we do with it? But, you know, it's not just about how can we produce it. It's also about having people that care enough about the food to actually demand that food and give it a market, which is what this guy called Robert LaValva is doing in New York. he's trying to reinvent the geography that once fed New York. So here's a picture of the East River to the east of Manhattan, cows lining up, waiting to be ferried across to the site that he's pointing to with his finger there, which then evolved into Fulton Fish Market, which is where he set up what he calls New Amsterdam Market as a farmer's market to try to show that, yes, a market can be successful here, but it doesn't need to just be a local farmer's market. It could actually be a wholesale market that starts to be really significant in the way the city feeds itself again, and then the city takes responsibility, and all sorts of things start to be possible. Smaller retailers can buy from there and so on. It's a sort of, it's going back to a pre-supermarket model. Of course, the city can't feed itself from within itself. I've said that in various different ways, but there are ways we can move towards more of the city feeding itself. Of course, if you think of von Thunen, who I told you about, probably feels like a very, very long time ago, but anyway, it is quite a long time ago, isn't it? Sorry, I'll be very quick and nearly there. This is an interpretation of that model that growing communities in London have come up with, which is to say, okay, the city can't feed itself completely, but let's see how much fruit and veg we can grow in the city, in the periphery, in the local area, within 100 miles, and then, you know, gradually go out to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world and so on. And by educating people to understand the impact of how they eat, we can effectively grow the inner rings, we can make them bigger. And she has this other idea, which I think is brilliant, which is patchwork farm, which means that you can either, you know, she runs an organic box scheme, by the way, but, you know, you can either grow food in small scale little patches in the city, or you can do a deal with a banana grower, you know, in the Caribbean or something. It's all part of the same thing, but we have to recognize it as the same thing and treat everyone well. Of course, there's a huge amount of latent fertility in cities, and this is being discovered by various architects. Ideas like continuous productive urban landscapes, which is what CPOL stand for, which is the idea of just post-fitting the city with, you know, sort of long, stringy bits of allotment and, you know, recreation, or Fritz Haig's project in America called Edible Estates, where he is proposing converting all of these lovingly watered, useless front lawns in suburbia into cornucopias of productivity. Of course, the tragedy is that the really most inspirational examples about the kind of, you know, what you can produce from within a city come from crisis. You know, so London during the war, Havana after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or Detroit after the motor company left. You know, and in fact, it's very interesting what's going on in Detroit. They've actually got a label now called Grown in Detroit, and people sort of buy that deliberately because they know they're actually reinforcing the economy of the local city. But it has to be crisis economics, as I say, because we don't recognize the true economics of the situation. If we did, we'd all be doing this. Two more great examples from New York. This is what I think is vertical farming that does work, and it's basically sticking a greenhouse on top of an existing building, which happens to also be a food hub. Brilliant, fantastic, and also education, because people go up there and they go, ooh, that's what a plant looks like, is it? You know, the Jamie Oliver thing. Glenn Flanner, fabulously, you know, natural educator, who's converted an enormous rooftop in Brooklyn, also, you know, the first ever to receive planning permission to go back from commercial to agricultural use within the city. And he's got a very viable farm up there of 2.5 acres. You don't do acres, do you? About a hectare. But big enough to be really, you know, seriously productive. But of course, most of the food for the city will always come from the countryside. That is the urban paradox. And therefore, we have to care about farmers too. And of course, the good thing now is that in the UK, we've got people with perfectly good degrees and jobs in labs and so on, and offices saying, I don't want to do this, I want to be a farmer again. And this guy, Jimmy Doherty, was one of them, and he actually got a TV program about his pig farm in the end, and in fact, ironically, has now become a TV presenter. But anyway, he's actually a good mate of Jamie Oliver's. But no, there are many people like him who are just seeing that actually people do want to do the right thing, but of course, it's just a tiny little pocket of, let's face it, quite rich people. Now, how do we expand it, and how do we make actually good food, you know, affordable? Because, of course, the more it's made, the more affordable it becomes. And then, of course, technology is now linking up farmers who were once completely isolated and allowing them to be connected. So it's actually now possible to live in the countryside and not be isolated anymore. This is very, very important. There's a lot further we can go with this. As I said, there's lots of people talking about wacky ideas about how to solve the problem with technology. I can go into those more if you're interested, but basically growing plants under pink light with an enormous computer telling you exactly what's happening to every bit of the plant and monitoring it every second, you can reduce the energy by about a third, but who's going to own this stuff and where's it going to go? Using sunlight, you condense seawater and produce fresh water and grow a load of vegetables in the middle of the Sahara. Nobody lives there, so that doesn't work either. This is the trouble with utopia. I'm sure you all have your views on GM. I'm sure that'll come up later. Learning our lessons. I told you about the jungle ages ago. Of course, I'm sure you heard about the horse meat scandal. You probably had the horse meat scandal. Probably not as bad as we did, because, of course, do you eat horse in Portugal? Yes. Okay, exactly. So in the UK, because of the squeamish thing I was explaining earlier, we don't. So not only were people going, you mean my unbelievably cheap €30 hamburger isn't full of minced up fillet steak? They were also saying, it's horse, and we do not eat horse culturally, which is, of course, insane, but we just don't. It's just one of those things. But, it's exactly the same story all over again 100 years later. And, of course, the supermarkets all reacted very much saying, oh, we're so sorry, we'll never do it again. And then that's all disappeared, and that was only about 3 months ago. Just to say scale is a really big issue here. There are fantastic ideas like aquaponics, fish, poo in the water, make it fertile, put it through tomatoes, the tomatoes grow on it, filter the water out, send it back to the fish. Fantastic. Will Allen, very inspirational character in America, good friend of Michelle Obama's these days, has a firm called Growing Power, empowering communities to produce their own food in a really cheap way. Brilliant idea. It gets scaled up by the Dutch government, and it's called Greenport Shanghai, which is a proposal which I understand is not now being built, although a big greenhouse is on the site, on a sort of environmentally sensitive island just outside Shanghai, which is that idea at the scale of Heathrow Airport. So it's tomatoes on the top deck, then fish, then pigs, and then poo. And they've got a kind of theme park, and the Chinese are really, well, as I say, that's the thing. Is it the same if it scales up? I don't think it is. So many issues there. And then many issues to do with also how we can replicate the natural loop that cities used to have, which was eating their own shit, not to put too fine a point on it. And this is a very well-known, well-known if you read arcane books about sewage systems, I suppose. Probably not well-known otherwise. Anyway, amazing example. This is the sewage system that Victor Hugo was so upset about, because basically all the nutrients of Paris were being flushed away. But as it turned out, they weren't being flushed far enough because the Seine doesn't flow very fast. And they all got stuck around about here. And then one of the causing terrible hazard to shipping. And then one of the sewage engineers had a brilliant idea of filtering the sewage water through gravel beds to create this incredible market garden and turning a totally unfertile area into an incredibly fertile one. And this thing was operating until the 1970s, believe it or not. Of course, China used to have productive gardens around all its cities. These are now being built over, and therefore that's why it's buying up bits of Brazil and so on. So how do we make that work in the modern context? Of course, it's a lot more difficult. Our sewage is not pure anymore. It's not purely organic, much more difficult. But we are going to have to start retrieving, for instance, phosphorus in our own sewage, because we're running out of mined phosphorus. And as I'm sure some of you know, phosphorus is one of the 3 key ingredients that plants need to eat. Before I finish, just to say that while we're busy reinventing the wheel, there's actually half the world that's still doing the wheel. And we shouldn't forget that cities like Dharavi in India, informal cities with 1 million inhabitants, are feeding themselves somehow. And actually people are starting to look at these kinds of informal food systems and say, what can we learn? I think it's a global conversation we have to be having. Not only to say to countries like this, don't, whatever you do, go down the road we've gone down, but also what can we learn from you? So that's a very important conversation to have. As I say, the positive thing is that, there are many people out there, don't have to tell you who he is, And there are many tools that we can use as well: taxation, planning. People, food is starting to be recognized in planning circles as important. Thank goodness for that. We forgot it for 200 years. It's coming back. Co-producing, I mentioned also. That's another example of community-supported agriculture, which is basically people literally working with the farmer to produce their own food. Very famous example outside Chicago called Angel Organics. And of course, not least, these ideas of integrating with nature and educating people to understand what the true value of food really is. As I say, it's all a question of balance. There's no one answer to this paradox. If we live off the land, we're going to have to kind of kill off about 90% of the population. We're going to be very lonely. This is what we're doing at the moment, and it isn't working. I think there are a range of options that are more somewhere in the middle, and these are the ones that I think we're going to have to examine as we're going forward. We need vision. Whether this is what SITOPIA looks like in 2050, I don't know, but I think just the idea of remaining optimistic and saying, actually, the city is a better place if food becomes visible in it again, and we celebrate it, and we enjoy it, and we allow it time, as Carlo Petrini says. But last but not least, I want to leave you with as I say, I wish I had them on sale outside, or I just give them to you, actually, but I hope, actually, I have given them to you. I hope that I've given you food-shaped glasses through which you can now look at the world and say, wow, food shapes our lives so powerfully. If we understand that and act on it, we can affect huge change in very, very small ways. It doesn't have to be utopian. Just tiny changes in every day, what we do, maybe cooking one more meal a week, maybe having friends over, maybe bothering to go to the market rather than the supermarket, actually collectively makes a huge difference. So that's what I want to leave you with. We can change the world through food, and I want to do it with you. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good, people liked it. Shall we go for the questions? Okay, you must be tired.
No, actually, this is energizing.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
it's good. Talking about food and sex, the only two things that and singing probably, that you have more energy when you finish than when you begin.
Okay, we're going just to start a brief question and answer session. I would ask you to put your hands up, and I would ask you not to make big statements, but really questions, so that we can have more people making questions and hear a bit more of Carolyn has to tell us. Yes? Someone want? No, you've been. Okay, we have one there. The first one is always the.
Okay, thank you for your conference, and I'd like to ask you if still you think we should have measures to shrink cities, or is it okay to just leave them like that or something? And examples of taxation, what kinds of things to be taxed in order to, with your SITOPIAN tools.
I mean, two very interesting questions. I mean, in terms of the size of the city, I think as I said, I'm really excited now because there is an emergent discipline and it's called food planning. It's been around for 10 years or so. And it's simply resulted from a paper written by two planners, Cami Potacucci and Gerard Kaufman in America, saying the relevance of food to urban development. And the American Planning Authority recognized this paper and then on the back of it wrote a paper called Food Planning. That's 10 years only old. Now, I think if you imagine urban development through food, you would not develop cities in the way that we are. you would recognize the importance of the land that literally most of them are growing on is unbelievably fertile soil, because as I said, most cities already evolved in the most fertile places for that very reason. So you would probably protect, you know, a bit like London has a protected layer of green belt around it, which is under threat, by the way, because people keep saying, oh, we can't protect this boring old farmland anymore, we've got to build on it. Yes, we absolutely have to protect it, but then we have to say, how can we make it economic for farmers to grow food here again? Now, these are lots and this is where your taxation thing comes in, because, by the way, I had it up and then I didn't talk about it, as one tends not to when one knows one's running out of time, but, I think this, permaculture, is a really fascinating way of thinking about lots of things, actually, but I mean also the interface between the city and the countryside, which permaculture always recognises the most productive areas of an organism are where difference meets, you know, so coming together. So I think we need to design cities that maximise the interface between city and country. Now, actually, if you go back a few more slides and think of what I was showing with Ebenezer Howard, that's exactly what he was trying to do. I mean, he didn't think of it in those terms, but limiting the city is one way of maximising that interface. Another way, as I say, is to say to cities, look, let's not have suburbs coming right in and joining up exactly where the city currently is, but let's have green bands, you know, or corridors, which is what sepals is. So that other idea I flashed past you very quickly, that's corridors of productivity, many, many ways. But in the end, as I say, it's a paradox. There's no perfect pattern. But recognising that, you have to make it economic for the farmers to do the farming. And actually, the really interesting thing is that the woman I told you about a little bit earlier, going back through my whole lecture now, it's a very good couple of questions you asked. But I mean, this woman who runs this box scheme here, Growing Communities, Julie Brown, she said, there is no limit of farmers who want to feed people living in Hackney, which, by the way, is a food desert in East London. She said, but people are not prepared to pay the amount of food, for the amount of money it costs them to produce it. Now, again, I totally understand. I mean, we're all suffering Euro crisis, of course, and many people are turning back to producing their own vegetables as a result of that, and that's another aspect of it. But what we're currently doing with taxation is we're making hideous, industrial food artificially cheap. So you could remove all the subsidies from Tate and Lyle and Monsanto and, you know, Archer Daniels, Midland, and I mean, you know, you just name all these, who are getting huge multi-million-dollar handouts from the government to do what they do, which is oppress the rest of the food industry. So that's one thing. I mean, you know, there was another of these images, actually. There was a sort of unproposed tax for, you know, fizzy drinks. You know, so-called fat tax. Basically, let's tax food that is kind of 0 calories, you know. And Mayor Giuliani was trying to sort of limit. I mean, so there was a proposal for that in California, which got voted down by the food lobby. Then Mayor Giuliani in New York tried to bring in a limit on the size of soft drink cartons, and he was again defeated at the last minute. So there are hidden, I mean, I actually often, I mean, Sophia said, you know, architects can see sort of buildings where there aren't any. I think another thing we can see, which is interesting, is we can see invisible structures. You know, you can see how many interwoven interests, political, economic, social, underlie all of this. And that's really where we need to go to. So if one could see the taxation streams in food, there would be a riot. And then there would be action. But much can be done. Thank you for the questions. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Convening my own. Sorry, I did one last week.
I would like to know your view upon what can we do to fight against this new law about seeds European Union is preparing.
Seeds is a huge issue, and I mean, well, the trouble is, as you indicate, I mean, basically, the only bodies big enough to fight the Monsantos of this world are actually now multinational organizations. I mean, even national governments they're failing to act, if you like. And I think and there's a huge amount of lobbying going on. I mean, you know, and certain countries are still holding out, but you know, it's just a question of time with all the dominoes falling. For me, I mean, and I often say, you know, actually to deal with these kinds of issues, we need action at every scale. So it's fantastic to have, you know, protest organisations which are doing everything they possibly could. It would be amazing to have national parties, you know, who actually campaigned on the basis of doing the right thing about food. But actually to stop something like the spread of GM, you know, we need international agreement. And I don't think you will stop the spread of GM. I mean, if there was, you know, if I saw a map the other day of how much of the world is already growing it, I mean, it's coming. But I think there are various aspects of it that can be controlled. Certainly, control of GM needs to be controlled, and it's unacceptable to me that, you know, certain companies have the degree of control over the food system that the Monsantos of this world do. So that's one issue, ownership, if you like. Secondly is testing. I mean, at the moment, you know, there is no real acknowledgement that any sort of seed is going to be tested for a particular period. And in fact, you know, the legislation is so open that there is effectively no protection for farmers if they're sort of growing next door to a sort of a GM field and they accidentally start to promulgate this stuff. They're sued by the company. So, I mean, what can we do? I mean, we can protest, we can write letters as individuals, we can demand that our governments take action. But I think at EU level, the ideal thing would be a proposal to actually say it's illegal to make money out of ownership of seeds. And seeds should be only held in government-controlled repositories. And you re-democratise ownership of seed. And you cannot sue a farmer for saving seed. You know, I mean, that seems to me to be, of all the invidious and hideous laws and the sort of trade agreements that control all of this, of course, it goes into the World Trade Organization's, you know, its way of doing global trade agreements over food, and the fact that, you know, it's actually illegal for countries to opt out of certain trading relationships. I mean, it's such a big thing. That, you know, I simply think, you know, at any level, whether it's government or whether it's individuals or whether it's groups, we actually have to, I mean, Vandana Shiva wrote a very good manifesto about seed and the importance of seed being something that was pure, you know, and that like a common, it's like a commons that can't be controlled by a company or a government. You know, really, we need to campaign, I guess, for that to be politically adopted. I mean, it's a huge issue, and but I think, again, you know, I come back to the visibility thing. I think if people actually could really see what was going on, they would be storming Parliament House. You know, that's the difficulty. But I'm afraid I don't have any sort of silver bullet answers. But no, again, thank you for the question.
Okay.
No? Yes, okay. How safe it is to grow food in cities? Is there a danger of soil and air contamination? And if there is so, what could be the solution? Maybe creating new cities where fuel-moved vehicles wouldn't be allowed? What kind of solutions would you suggest or propose?
Yeah, I mean, again, a very, very good question. I mean, interestingly, most of the urban food growing projects that I know that have sprung up recently are actually not in the real soil. They've basically put a membrane in and then they've put soil on top. So there is a sort of toxic underlayer, if you like. Or they just literally grow in, you know, sort of bags. And so you're right. I mean, there is an issue, certainly, with contaminated soil. I mean, interestingly, I was talking to somebody recently about this, and they said that the threat from car fumes is actually a lot lower than it was because the amount of lead in petrol has been brought down anyway because of, again, I guess a good thing that the EU's done, legislation. So actually, the levels of of, you know, trace metals getting into food through the air are actually now not an issue, certainly in sort of cities like London, but the soil still is. So, I mean, there are amazing, again, I mean, you know, if you start to look on the internet, you can see incredible solutions to these problems. Bioremediation, for instance, you know, it's actually possible to, if you sow certain plants and leave them there for long enough, the soil cleans itself. You know, but whether we have the sort of the time, the patience, or whether it would be deemed economically viable to do that in the centre cities, I don't know. But the solutions are there, and I think this is in a way why I come back always to the relationship between what's technically possible and what's socially possible or what's politically possible, because they're never quite the same. But, you know, in answer to your question, yes, I mean, I think, you know, my point, you know, when we do build new cities, which of course we are building at a rate of knots, let's not build them on prime farmland, but next to prime farmland, and solve the problem that way. But no, I mean, and also obviously building new farms on rooftops like Ben Flanner is. I mean, he's actually developing, actually in association with a thing called the Gaia Institute in New York, which has developed what they call Gaia soil, which is a lightweight, proper soil that can be put on roofs and therefore makes far more roofs able to sort of, you know, stand the load of having actual soil on them rather than just aquaponics or plant pots. So there are ways, but it is a big problem. You're absolutely right.
First of all, thank you very much.
Welcome.
I just remembered one technique used in sort of in response to the last question with, I could say, guerrilla gardening in Britain, where people first started out seeding sunflowers, especially in borders and so on, unoccupied pseudo-green spaces in the city. They can be sunflowers, there can be other plants that do remove a lot of the toxic material from the soil and eventually can improve the soil and be used for that. The question I have for you is I'm not sure quite how to put it, but you seem to me a very hopeful person, and that's great to hear. But my doubt, one of my doubts, strongest lately, is what seems to be a fight between the total lack of ethics and the total focus on finance rather than real economics, which is eating and sleeping and so on. Between that lack of ethics and the hope of changing us. What we do is have to change us and take a leap somewhere.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
No, I completely agree. I mean, it sounds like, you know, you and I come from the two countries where, if you like, one is most aware of these kinds of issues. But, you know, I always say that, you know, one of the powerful things about food is that it's both a metaphor and something very, very real and necessary, you know, so you cannot get lost in. I've suddenly gone all boomy and echoey. Anyway, maybe that's what I should have sounded like all along. Sounds a bit like, you know, sort of voice from the clouds, which is worrying. You know, so absolutely, as you say, you know, for me, the lack of, our failure to value food, to put it in shorthand, is no different to our failure to value life. It's that bad. And therefore, the banking crisis is just, if you like, a kind of, it's almost automatic that would have happened, because we've so lost grip on what matters, what doesn't matter, what the value of somebody is. I mean, I sometimes in even longer lectures, which I occasionally give, you'll be horrified to hear, you know, I just have a sort of image of people working, you know, and some of them are sort of milking a cow and some of them are sitting crouched over a computer, and I say, what's a good life, you know? And it's so interesting that we've moved so far away from the real into the abstract with a banking system that is effectively no better than, as we all know, a pyramid selling system, It's built to crash. And money itself relates to itself and nothing else. There's a brilliant book on this, which is actually also readable, called The Value of Nothing by Raj Patel, if this is your bag. But the thing is, and that's why I love this. I mean, you know, of course you can't put a value on a hamburger, really, and say what is the value of climate change, what is the value of, you know, someone suffering, what is the value of, you know, peak oil. But because even in the act of chucking money at it, you devalue it in a sense. You play their game, you know. And I think what I'm arguing for is that food becomes the new money. You know, in other words, we say, what is the value of food? And by the way, wish me luck. I'm literally about to start writing another book as a follow-up to Hungry City. The working title is Tone 2, which is a bit of a joke because I can't work out what to call it, but I've variously called it things like the idea of food or the power of food or the value of food. But it's actually, my question is, what is food? You know, and if we really ask that question properly, it seems to me, we will have to answer that food is life, and therefore that good food is good life. And therefore, if we don't, you know, have it absolutely at the heart of our thinking, physically and mentally, in the middle of our cities, and if we don't value it, then we simply have a massive value schism somewhere in our society. So I'm really hoping to use food and its tangibility to reach that kind of abstract question. But as I say, wish me luck. But yeah, very much it's on my mind. Thank you for the question.
Any further questions?
When's dinner, I think, probably, if anyone's got any.
Yeah. Okay.
One more there, if we have time for one more. Sorry.
Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So it looks like food is not going to be in the political agenda anytime soon. The only thing that's in the agenda currently is economics and finance. So the change has to come from the people by the way we consume food, basically. And also there's one issue that you haven't mentioned, which is the role of schools.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this is one very important point. I mean, if a change is going to come, it has to start very, very early on.
Yeah.
And all this, I would like to ask you if you've been going to schools, and what would be the role of schools in the change that we need. And just, sorry, just a second question is, if the industrial food production is just ruining our planet and our health, the alternative food production systems that you've mentioned quite a few examples here, but of course the industrial food system says though, oh, we won't be able to feed the enormous population that we have. So population is really a problem. I know you've mentioned this very briefly, but how are we going to feed the rising population?
Okay, I'm going to try and answer those all fairly briefly. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. The sort of, I mean, actually, I'd be very interested to ask you, but maybe not here, but sort of outside informally, how the current economic crisis has affected the way people in Portugal have started eating differently. I mean, of course it does make a difference, because what happens is the relative cost of food actually does start to go up again. And then people do start to sort of hunt for bargains and start to do more home cooking. It's happened in the UK as well. And of course you see extreme examples of it, and I was showing them earlier, you know, when I was showing, for instance, you know, Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, I mean, the entire nation went back to farming because they had to, and we see it in Greece. You know, people have gone back to farming, and in fact they've cut out the middleman, and I mean, there was a sort of whole movement around basically farmers driving lorries into towns and people buying directly off the lorries and so on. So we see those kinds of shifts. Schools, completely, absolutely, yes. If anybody ever asks me, you know, what single thing would you do to try to make a change, I would say turn classrooms into kitchens. Full stop. You can teach absolutely everything from a kitchen. You can teach geography, history, literature, sociability, mathematics, science, anything you want. And it's absolutely outrageous that people, kids are not, they're taught all this kind of ridiculous things like critical film theory, and they're not taught how to feed their own bodies. I mean, this is insane. Okay, so totally, I've written pop. Oh, but how are we going to, yeah. Now, there's a really interesting statistic, which is that the process through which we produce artificial fertilizer, which is called the Haber-Bosch process, which is extremely energy heavy and energy consumptive, but it replicates lightning strikes and fixes nitrogen artificially that way, is reckoned to be how we're feeding 40% of the global population at the moment, i.e. they simply would have starved to death were it not for that. Now, the thing is, that is all argued from the industrial paradigm. And whenever you hear people arguing, how are we going to feed the world? We can only do it that way. It's always from the industrial paradigm. And in fact, one of my slides that I took out, because I always try to save audiences from listening to me for 85 hours, was my one about polarization. But it's a really big point of mine and a passion, actually, that we have to stop thinking in these artificially polarized ways. So, actually, industrial food is, as we discovered, what it's delivering is, something that tends towards 50% wastage rate. Before we start saying, ooh, we can't find any, let's start addressing that 50%, with which, by the way, we're currently producing enough food globally to feed the whole planet and more, but we're not using the food. So, and also if you measure, sorry, just one other point, it's really important though, before you all leave, that if you measure I didn't have a picture of it, but a forest garden, which is a sort of a food productive space organized according to the principles of a tropical forest, with overlaid trees, nuts, berries, and we ate according to that, it's far, far more productive per acre than any industrial farming system ever invented. So it's utter ruddy nonsense that we can't feed the world organically, but it takes a major cultural shift. We need more farmers, we need more time spent on food, but that's fine, because it's great spending time on food. There's nothing better. I'm quite looking forward to doing a bit of it this evening. So thank you for all of those questions, and we can discuss more outside, I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Two more, sorry.
I think it's...
This lady here and that gentleman over there. Sorry.
Okay.
Is it on? Yes. Okay, so I'm happy that I'm not the last one, because it's nice to hear you being so hopeful, but this is a very depressing question. So I think you've shown all of these nice examples about co-production and rooftop gardening and all of that, but I think we're being very Eurocentric or US-centric. So we see all of these nice examples in Europe and in the United States. But if you actually look, for instance, at Africa, and you had one nice photo of a small farmer in Kenya, but if you look at Africa, where most of the food is actually still coming from, the picture is very, very depressive. So not only they are making the exact same mistakes that we made 50 or 100 years old about building cities and completely destroying all of the farmland, but also even where you still have farmland, it's just being bought off by huge companies, and local farmers are losing access. So we seem to be trying to solve these small problems in Europe, in the United States, and being very hopeful and slightly hippie about it, right? But if you look at Africa, especially Africa, but also Latin America, it's a huge problem and a very serious deal that I do not see us in Europe, because we're also very concerned with the crisis being occupied with. So how do you see it? What do you think we can do?
Well, I mean, obviously I didn't focus on the global south today, but in a way that's why I had this slide in, and I think I did say actually this is a global problem and it's not just about Europe, but of course you have to approach it from your own viewpoint. And I'm from London and I'm in Lisbon, so and I do think in order to understand what's going on in Africa, and I agree with you, I mean, I hope I haven't given the impression that I think it's all going to be fine and lovely. I think we've got a massive crisis on our hands, but part of recognizing what not to do in Africa is, as I said when I showed this slide, is to go to places like that and say, look, don't follow our example, let's work together to see what another approach can be. Of course, that's not what's happening as you refer. I mean, you know, the Green Revolution, so-called, in India, which is now being replicated in Africa, huge amounts of money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, going into that. I'm sure with the best of intentions, but yes, they are simply repeating all of our mistakes. And yes, again, I mean, but like the lady who has now, in fact, left, I think, so that tells you something. The lady who asked about the seeds, you know, I mean, basically, it should be also a matter of international outrage and concern that, as you say, large chunks of productive farmland are being sold off on 999-year leases to foreign countries, so farmers can't get access and so on. I mean, I think these are the kinds of questions that the UN tries to debate. Of course, it's got no teeth, but it's the best thing we've got. But certainly, I mean, people like us, I mean, I absolutely don't think, I mean, I don't think it's a Eurocentric or indeed European and American-centric problem, but I think we are the ones that have invented this model. So in a way, it's our responsibility to say, you know, it hasn't worked, it is not working, and what are the answers? And of course, those are, you know, those are the kinds of conversations we need to be having with countries that haven't gone down this path yet. So I'm not a sort of you know, Pollyanna optimist in that sense, but I do think the more we understand where we've gone wrong, the more we can actually have a positive conversation and say, look, you know, it hasn't worked. Here are the warning signs, and can we just sort of suggest that we together work on a plan C, actually? It's an international conversation.
I think this is the last one, and then that's it. Do you still want to...
A lot of questions that I wanted to ask you have already been answered. But I read recently on a newspaper about a study, I think it was made by an European organization, by the UN, that until 2050 you will need to produce 70% more food than the one you are producing now. This obviously means that you need to reduce at the same time your impact on ecology. At the same time, and now I'm speaking as a Portuguese and European citizen, there is a big economical issue. People are starting to think about how to eat cheap instead of how to eat green, as to say. And I just want to ask you, what can you tell to these people that we look first for the $2 hamburger, despite all of the chain that you explained?
Well, I mean, two things there. I mean, the first thing is that, you know, that statement about the 70% food is hugely controversial in food circles, and it's hotly disputed. And of course, it goes back slightly to what I was saying just now about the industrial paradigm being just assumed to be the correct one. In other words, we're producing this much now, and we're only feeding so many, therefore we must have to produce that much to feed that many. But you know, as I say, if the most industrialized nations are currently wasting 50% of their food, and completely unindustrialized nations are wasting about 30 or 40 for kind of the opposite reasons, actually, ironically, there's a huge amount we could do well, I mean, I'm sitting next to someone who's spent the last few years thinking about nothing but food waste, but, you know, it's just an idiotic approach. So that's thing one. I mean, idiotic only in that it assumes that we'll carry on wasting at this rate, therefore we have to produce that much. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, it's just so, it's like you're talking about life and how we should live and all of that, and actually all you can do is, you know, sort of like, well, that's that big and that's that big. It's so simplistic. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say, and it's related to it, and you raise it, is that all of this is hugely, hugely cultural. And I tried to get that across earlier in my talk when I just said, you know, you don't pretend it's just this flow and it's just that simple. Everything is affected by everything else about, you know, preferences, beliefs, duties, rituals, history. And, you know, it's notorious that if you have people literally starving, and you fly them an emergency load of food, but it's not what they normally eat, they won't eat it. You know, so it's hugely, I mean, the amazing thing about food is that on the one hand, it's extremely general, we all have to eat to live. On the other hand, it's as individual as you and me eat differently, you know, even within a culture. So that makes it incredibly difficult to come up with one-size-fits-all solutions. But what I can say is that, I mean, and this is a huge issue in the UK as well, because we're also suffering like you, and actually, you know, it's a very different society, but we have shocking numbers of people. I mean, there are 13 boroughs in London where the kids live under the bread line, in London, you know. So you think of London as a very rich, big city. It has very poor districts. And of course, they're also in food deserts, as I don't have to tell you, because, you know, we went through that earlier. How does somebody like that, you know, feed themselves? And it's very hard because physically they don't have access to the food. But of course, you know, people, if you do have access even to really basic ingredients and you cook for yourself, you can feed yourself unbelievably well for about 10 quid a week, you know. And people are currently spending 100 quid a week on crap food, and it's absolutely notorious that, you know, 47 million Americans are living on food stamps. And most of what they go and spend their food, i.e. government handouts, because they're too poor to eat, and most of the food that they buy with that is soda, which is empty calories, you know, and burgers. But of course, they're in a culture that doesn't give them access to what they really need, which is, you know, fruit and vegetables, basically, and a bit of grain. Going back right to the beginning, grain is the food of cities. That's what sustains us. You know, and the well-balanced diet is something that the wonderful Mediterranean culture, Portuguese food knows, and you're still eating now, but you, like every other nation on earth, is gradually moving away from this blindingly obvious way of feeding yourself well for not very much money towards an idiot diet. What can I say? I mean, you know, and we're much further along the road than you are. So it's cultural, embrace food, value it, campaign to, you know, preserve what you already have and build on it, and come on a deputation to London and tell us how to eat, please.
Okay, I think that's it. I would just... I just wanted to say... They don't want to listen to me. I just wanted to sort of close saying that I think the food system, our food system world is based on the culture that, as we have heard in the questions and also in Carolyn's lecture, doesn't privilege neither ethical or environmental dimensions that are in it. And so it's really a senseless problem. It makes absolutely no sense that we have this problem, but yet we do have it. And so there are no easy answers. And I think Mark invited Carolyn because this is a transition cycle, and it's going to be a transition phase. And so to get to any type of answers, we'll have to go through a desert, through a transition phase that is not easy, and that's why we are not entering it. But nevertheless, that's probably what we have to start thinking. And also, as someone said, food is not in the political agenda, and that's what we need to do probably, is to put food in the political agenda. And now, yes, please, a warm applause to Carolyn.
Thank you very much.